Action Park did not emerge suddenly as a dangerous place. It was shaped slowly, deliberately, and methodically through a series of choices rooted in the personality, beliefs, and priorities of its creator and the era in which it was born. Eugene Jean Mulvihill came from a background that prized aggression, confidence, and bending systems rather than respecting them. As a former Wall Street commodities trader, he was accustomed to environments where speed mattered more than caution and where risk was not something to be minimized but something to be exploited. When he acquired the Vernon Valley Ski Resort in New Jersey during the 1970s, he was looking for a way to turn an underperforming seasonal business into a year-round profit machine, and he saw opportunity in the growing popularity of water-based recreation combined with America's appetite for thrill. Regulation of amusement and water parks at the time was fragmented and underdeveloped, especially compared to today, and Mulvihill understood that the gaps between agencies, unclear jurisdiction, and outdated safety standards gave him freedom to experiment without meaningful oversight. Instead of hiring established ride manufacturers and engineers to design attractions, he relied heavily on in-house ideas, improvisation, and rapid construction, believing that experience and intuition were better than formal engineering constraints. The terrain itself became part of the problem before a single ride was installed. The park was built on steep, uneven mountain slopes originally meant for skiing, not summer foot traffic or water attractions, and rather than reshaping the land to reduce hazards, the layout embraced it. Pathways slanted sharply, water flowed downhill across walkways, and guests spent the entire day climbing, descending, slipping, and navigating crowded slopes while barefoot or wearing thin water shoes that offered little traction. Drainage was inconsistent, meaning puddles formed constantly, algae built up on concrete surfaces, and slick conditions became permanent features of the park's environment. These details mattered because injuries often began before guests ever reached a ride, with twisted ankles, falls, and collisions becoming normalized parts of the experience that blended seamlessly into the larger pattern of harm. From the beginning, Mulvihill rejected the concept of heavy staffing and professional oversight, viewing it as expensive and unnecessary. He preferred a young workforce that would accept low wages, minimal training, and a culture of casual authority. Teenagers were recruited in large numbers, many of them barely older than the guests they were supervising, and placed into roles that demanded responsibility without providing the structure to support it. Training sessions were brief, informal, and often conducted by other teenagers who themselves had learned on the job only days earlier. Manuals were sparse or non-existent, and safety procedures were passed along verbally, often distorted or incomplete by the time they reached new employees. This created a workplace where rules were suggestions rather than mandates, and enforcement depended entirely on individual judgment rather than standardized policy. Supervisors were few, stretched thin across large areas of the park, and more focused on keeping rides operational and lines moving than on stopping unsafe behavior. Shutting down a ride for safety concerns was discouraged implicitly, because it reduced revenue and irritated crowds, and employees quickly learned that speed and compliance were rewarded more than caution. This culture extended directly to how guests were treated. Instructions for rides were minimal and often vague, delivered quickly to keep lines moving, and rarely enforced once guests were on the attraction. Height and weight limits existed in theory but were frequently ignored when crowds grew large, because checking them slowed throughput and invited arguments. Guests learned by watching others rather than listening to staff, and when they saw people riding fast, breaking rules, or crashing without immediate consequences, they interpreted that as permission to do the same. Alcohol amplified every flaw in this system. Beer was widely available, consumption was openly tolerated, and intoxication was rarely addressed unless it became disruptive. Guests drank under the hot sun, dehydrated quickly, and grew increasingly reckless as the day went on, while staff lacked both the authority and the inclination to intervene consistently. The park's messaging, both explicit and implicit, reinforced this behavior. Marketing emphasized freedom, toughness, and thrill rather than safety or family-friendliness, and word-of-mouth stories glorified injuries as proof of bravery. The Alpine Slide, one of the earliest and most iconic attractions, embodied these values perfectly. Built as a long concrete track descending the mountain, it placed riders on small sleds with exposed wheels and a single metal brake lever. Riders controlled their own speed entirely, despite having little understanding of how momentum, centrifugal force, or surface conditions would affect them. The concrete track was unforgiving, with tight curves, uneven patches, and minimal barriers separating riders from hard ground. Maintenance crews patched cracks and damage as quickly and cheaply as possible, often leaving rough surfaces that caught wheels or destabilized sleds. Riders who leaned incorrectly or braked too late were thrown violently from the track, skidding across concrete or colliding with rocks and embankments. The injuries that resulted were so frequent that they lost their shock value. Abrasions ground through skin layers, earning the nickname Action Park tattoos, and broken bones, concussions, and dental injuries became accepted risks rather than reasons to reconsider the ride's design. Helmets were inconsistently required, padding was minimal, and first aid responses were reactive rather than preventive. When the first fatal accident occurred in 1980, it was not treated as a turning point but as an inconvenience to be managed. Internal responses focused on minimizing disruption rather than re-evaluating safety philosophy, and the ride continued operating with little fundamental change. This response set a precedent that echoed throughout the park's history. Serious harm did not trigger reform, only temporary adjustments aimed at preserving business continuity. These early decisions, attitudes, and compromises laid the foundation for everything that followed. The danger of Action Park was not accidental or sudden. It was engineered slowly through neglect, ideology, and normalization. Every uneven walkway, every undertrained employee, every ignored warning, and every intoxicated guest was part of a system that quietly trained everyone involved to accept harm as ordinary. By the time the park expanded further and added even more extreme attractions, the groundwork had already been laid for disaster to become routine, and for tragedy to feel less like a failure and more like an expected outcome of the experience. As the seasons passed and Action Park settled into its rhythm, the daily operation of the park revealed how deeply dysfunction had been built into its routine, not as an occasional breakdown but as a permanent condition. A typical summer day began early with teenage employees arriving tired, sunburned from previous shifts, and often nursing minor injuries of their own, because staff were not insulated from the same dangers faced by guests. Morning meetings, when they happened at all, were brief and focused almost entirely on logistics such as which rides needed to open quickly and how to manage expected crowds, rather than on reinforcing safety protocols. Equipment checks were rushed or superficial, with visual inspections replacing proper mechanical testing, and rides were often declared ready based on whether they appeared to function rather than whether they functioned safely. As gates opened and guests poured in, the park quickly became loud, chaotic, and densely packed. Crowds clustered at popular attractions, creating long lines where impatience and peer pressure built steadily. Guests watched others ride, crash, limp away, or laugh through injuries, absorbing these outcomes as part of the entertainment rather than as warnings. This observational learning shaped behavior more powerfully than any instruction from staff. When riders saw someone fly off the Alpine Slide and get back up, bleeding but smiling, it reinforced the idea that injury was survivable, even desirable as proof of courage. Staff, seeing crashes repeatedly without immediate fatal outcomes, grew desensitized and less likely to intervene preemptively. The park's layout intensified these dynamics. Narrow walkways funneled crowds downhill, water spilled constantly from rides onto paths, and people carrying inner tubes collided with others climbing upward, creating frequent minor accidents that blurred into the background noise of the park. First aid stations were busy from the moment the park opened, treating cuts, bruises, sprains, and burns, yet they were structured to patch people up quickly and send them back out rather than to remove them from harm. This reinforced the idea that injury was a temporary inconvenience rather than a sign of systemic danger. As the day wore on, fatigue compounded every problem. Lifeguards at the wave pool rotated infrequently, standing for hours under the sun, eyes strained from scanning churning water filled with hundreds of bodies. Whistles blew constantly, not only to signal danger but almost reflexively, creating a soundscape where warnings lost meaning through overuse. Guests learned to ignore whistles unless a guard physically grabbed them, and even then resistance was common as people resented being pulled from the water or told to rest. The wave pool itself operated mechanically, generating waves on fixed cycles regardless of conditions in the water. There was no pause for overcrowding, no adjustment for visible exhaustion, no allowance for panic spreading through a group of struggling swimmers. When someone went under, guards reacted quickly, but rescues were often chaotic, with multiple guards entering the water, pulling victims out while new swimmers were already being pushed forward by incoming waves. These rescues blended into one another, making it difficult for staff to track who had already been assisted and who still needed help. Near drownings were common, and the difference between survival and death often came down to seconds, positioning, and sheer luck rather than systematic protection. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the park, ride operators faced their own pressures. Lines grew long, tempers flared, and management emphasized throughput, encouraging operators to keep rides moving even when conditions suggested they should pause. Mechanical anomalies were often ignored if a ride still functioned, because stopping it required supervisor approval and triggered complaints from guests. Operators learned to trust their instincts rather than manuals, restarting rides after minor malfunctions and improvising fixes that prioritized speed over safety. This improvisation culture extended to maintenance crews, who worked under pressure to keep attractions operational with limited budgets and time. Temporary fixes became permanent solutions, and structural issues were patched repeatedly instead of addressed comprehensively. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Alpine Slide's ongoing deterioration. Over time, cracks widened, edges chipped, and sleds suffered where that affected stability. Rather than redesigning the ride or reducing speeds, management relied on the assumption that riders would self-regulate, even as evidence showed that they did not. The presence of alcohol further undermined this assumption. As the afternoon progressed, intoxication levels increased, reaction times slowed, and bravado intensified. Guests dared each other to ride faster, to brake later, to lean harder into turns, treating the slide like a competition rather than a controlled descent. Crashes became more violent and injuries more severe, yet the ride continued operating as usual. When serious injuries occurred, the response focused on extraction and cleanup rather than prevention. Blood was washed from surfaces, damaged equipment removed quietly, and operations resumed with little acknowledgement of what had happened minutes earlier. This pattern repeated across attractions, creating a rhythm where danger was not an interruption but a constant undercurrent. The Cannonball Loop, even during its brief operational period, illustrated how this mindset extended to experimental rides. Its enclosed design meant staff could not easily observe what happened inside, and riders exited disoriented, sometimes injured, sometimes shaken but encouraged by peers to laugh it off. Complaints were dismissed as part of the thrill, and only when injuries accumulated rapidly did management intervene, shutting the ride down not as an admission of error but as a pragmatic decision to avoid further complications. This approach sent a clear message internally: risk was acceptable until it became unmanageable. Other attractions carried similar hidden dangers that unfolded slowly rather than explosively. Go-kart tracks encouraged speed with minimal barriers and inconsistent enforcement of driving rules, leading to collisions that caused neck injuries and fractures. Rope swings dropped riders into cold water, inducing shock that left some gasping and disoriented, yet these reactions were interpreted as excitement rather than distress. Cliff jumps rewarded distance and spectacle, encouraging guests to leap farther and higher without regard for water depth or entry technique, resulting in spinal compression injuries that sometimes did not become apparent until hours later. The kayak ride's electrical hazards reflected deeper maintenance failures, where exposed components remained unaddressed because the ride continued to function, until tragedy forced attention. Throughout all of this, emergency response became routinized. Ambulances arrived frequently, sometimes multiple times a day, yet their presence lost its urgency through repetition. Staff continued working as stretchers passed by, guests stepped aside briefly, and then returned to lines as if nothing unusual had occurred. Hospitals nearby adjusted staffing patterns to accommodate predictable surges of injured patients from the park, integrating action park casualties into their operational planning. This normalization extended to legal consequences as well. Lawsuits were handled quietly, often settled without public acknowledgement of fault, reinforcing the belief that injuries were manageable costs rather than indicators of failure. Insurance challenges were treated as obstacles to be worked around rather than signals to reform operations, leading to deceptive practices that kept the park running but deepened its ethical and legal compromises. All of these minute details, repeated daily, season after season, created a system where harm was not only possible but inevitable. Action Park functioned as a machine that converted thrill into injury through countless small mechanisms: fatigue, alcohol, poor training, rushed maintenance, overcrowding, and ideological resistance to regulation. Each factor alone might not have produced disaster, but together they formed an environment where serious injury and death were statistical outcomes rather than aberrations. By the time the park approached its later years, this pattern was so deeply ingrained that even those working within it struggled to imagine alternatives. Danger had become normal, risk had become routine, and survival itself had become part of the attraction, setting the stage for the tragedies, legal collapses, and eventual shutdown that would follow.